In response to the lack of equality between men and women in 19th century America, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony fought a revolutionary struggle to reform women's rights by using civil organizations, rebellions, and writings. Through many successes and failures, these determined women authored documents, sought out and gained support, and set the stage for the revolution of women's rights and freedoms in the 20th century. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was dedicated to making a change from the start. She was born on November 12, 1815 in Johnstown, New York. From elementary school, she had the opportunity to have an outstanding education. She studied many different languages and subjects, including law, with her father. By learning about law, she understood that she was living in a world that contained many flaws. She was appalled by the discrimination of gender that she heard in her father's law office. Her parents, Daniel Cady and Margaret Livingston Cady, created a strictly religious atmosphere in her home. She did not love her parents like a normal child. She actually feared them. Her father even wished that she were a boy. They did not influence or support her in anything she wanted to do. Simone Hosack, the minister of her Presbyterian church, gave her some of the support she needed that she was not being given from her parents. Also, at a young age, Elizabeth's cousin, Gerrit Smith, interested her in temperance and anti-slavery. This was just the start to her journey as a reformer in her society. On May 10, 1840, Elizabeth married Henry Brewster Stanton. Henry is also an abolitionist as well as a delegate in the World Anti-Slavery Convention. There, he was accompanied by Elizabeth. While at the convention in London, she met Lucretia Coffin Mott, who was also a delegate for anti-slavery. Lucretia Mott was an advocate for injustice and was a prominent female leader in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements. She was raised to be a self-reliant and independent woman in society. While attending a friend's boarding school, Mott was a gifted student and free thinker. She discovered that even within the Quaker society, female teachers were paid half the amount of male teachers' salary. Lucretia continued to be involved in the Quaker faith and become a minister. In her time, very few women spoke publicly, but she mastered the art with great eloquence and soft-spoken power. Like most Quakers, she was passionately opposed to slavery, and in 1837 founded the first anti-slavery society of women. She encouraged people to boycott all products produced by slave labor. While attending the Anti-Slavery World Convention in London, she was mortified when she and the other 5 female participants were not allowed to seat with the men. She found it so ironic that men opposed to the injustice of slavery could treat females so unequally. Mott quickly expanded her abolitionist agenda to include women's rights issues because of this inequality. Elizabeth and Lucretia talked for a long time and decided that they were going to hold a women's rights convention after their return to the United States. Before the convention was held, Elizabeth continued her work on temperance and abolition and helped out with the passage of the Married Women's Property Bill of New York State. In 1848, this bill finally became a law. Another revolutionary, Susan B. Anthony, was determined and hardworking, ready to take on any actions or challenges brought forth to her. She was born on February 15, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, raised in the Quaker tradition. Susan had a very different upbringing from Elizabeth. Her family members were all extremely active in the reform movement as well as temperance, anti-slavery, and the women's rights issues. Anthony was independent but supported by her family, unlike Stanton. She received a great education by attending a Quaker boarding school set up by her father. In 1846, she moved to Rochester, New York with her family, where she met many famous abolitionists. In 1851, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were introduced to each other. They both had the willingness, devotion, and the same goals in mind to achieve in fighting for women's rights. Right at the beginning, Stanton asked Anthony to come and stay with her. Although they were total opposites, their chemistry clicked so fast. They argued at times about their views on rights and freedoms, but together the women's rights movement was inspired. Their friendship was the beginning of the force to this movement. For 2 decades, accomplishment after accomplishment, Stanton and Anthony fought for women's rights tirelessly to gain rights and freedoms that women should have initially had. They changed the direction of American history and believed that failure is impossible. In 1852, when Susan B. Anthony attended her first women's rights convention in Syracuse, she declared that the right which women needed above every other, the one indeed which would secure to her all the others, was the right of suffrage. Women's advocates worked closely with the abolitionist movement to promote change and equal justice for African Americans. The abolitionist movement goal was to emancipate all slaves and end racial discrimination as well as segregation. Just like the women's rights movement, abolitionists fought through protests, writings, and created groups and organizations to spread their message across the land. Throughout history, women have always struggled to gain respect, equality, and share the same rights as men.
Stanton said people believed that
the right of suffrage will make the woman masculine. At the Seneca Falls Convention, 300 participants gathered together, including both male and females, in New York to discuss the plight of women's rights and set an agenda for change. The revolutionary speakers included Stanton and Mott, as well as the famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass. The three pioneers passionately advocated for economic, political, and social change. Elizabeth Cady Stanton spearheaded the formal Declaration of Sentiments, which comprised of 12 grievances. Some included women were denied the right to own property, earn a fair wage, and that women were not afforded equal educational opportunity. At the end of the two-day convention, most of the group voted to ratify the Declaration of Sentiments, which stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." During the 1850s, the women's rights movement gathered momentum but suffered a setback when priorities changed during the Civil War. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and in 1870 the 15th Amendment was ratified. This amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote. Stanton and Anthony were outraged and were determined to advance their cause. They believed that this was their chance to force the government and lawmakers to pass truly universal suffrage and equality under the law. As a result, they rebelliously refused to support the 15th Amendment. In 1869, this faction formed a civil organization called the National Women's Suffrage Association and began to fight for a suffrage amendment to the Constitution. They discussed whether they should support the 15th Amendment giving African Americans the right to vote and not women. They fought on a state-by-state basis. On November 1st, 1872, Susan B. Anthony went to the Rochester barbershop to take full action in the suffrage movement for women. All men refused her once, so she went to the New York Supreme Court to fight for registration, in which they finally gave in. Susan and her three sisters were added to the voting list. 3 days later, she did it. She voted in the presidential election, and for more than 3 weeks, the government did nothing about it. Later on, a United States Marshal came to her house signifying that she was going to be charged for unlawfully and wrongfully voting. She knew she did the right thing, so she stood there ready to be handcuffed. She was put in her room to be questioned, the same place that commissioners questioned slaves. She was finally released after a long day with her trial having been set for June. She took her illicit action to gain publicity by speaking to 29 villages surrounding her. The trial finally occurred on June 17, 1873, where Susan could not testify on her own behalf. The judge wrote his opinion down before arguments were even heard. Therefore, the jury found Susan guilty. She responded, "Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say. For in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights are all alike ignored." She portrayed the idea that women were degraded as citizens and known as subjects, that all laws were made interpreted by men and in favor of men because they were not fortunate enough to attain the right to vote, that this is not a so-called Republican government. By exposing the government case, she gained sympathy for women's suffrage everywhere. She realized that if women wanted to get anywhere in society, they would have to amend the Constitution and give up trying to gain the right to vote in court.
This animosity eventually faded, and in 1890, the American Women's and National Women's Suffrage Associations combined. By then, the suffragist approach had changed and advocates took a new and different perspective. Instead of arguing that women deserved the same rights as men because they were created equal, the new generation of reformers charged that women deserved the vote because they were different from men. In 1888, the International Council of Women was created, making women's rights now into a world issue. At the end of the 19th century, Idaho and Utah gave women the right to vote. Starting in 1910, some other states in the West began to extend the vote to women for the first time in almost 20 years. On August 26, 1920, the Constitution was finally ratified, giving women the right and honor to vote. Unfortunately, Stanton had died on October 26, 1902, and Anthony had died on March 13, 1906. Therefore, they were not lucky enough to see the day that all the hard work had paid off. Voting and political rights empowered citizens to participate and influence the future of the United States. Because of the diligent and relentless work of early activists, females are equal in the eyes of the law. This accomplishment was a long overdue success.